You're listening to The Portfolio Composer, hosted by me, Dr. Garrett Hope, where business and creativity go hand in hand. Join us at theportfoliocomposer.com for news, talks, and workshops. This episode is brought to you by Dorico, the music notation software from Steinberg. Dorico Pro 3 is a major new version, with game-changing advances in note input, notation, and engraving. Also available from Steinberg is Dorico Elements, an entry-level application that packs all of the essential power of Dorico Pro into a simple, streamlined package that is ideal for those getting started. Find out more later in the show. Welcome to the Portfolio Composer. I am your host, your coach, and your teacher, Garrett Hope. Today's episode features Jim Ginsburg. Jim is the founder of Cedille Records in Chicago. He is an avid music fan. This is a guy who's doing what he's doing because he's deeply passionate about music and about making music available to the world in the recorded format. He has supported the podcast in numerous ways, including the live event that we held a few years ago in the Fine Arts Building on Michigan Avenue. And he's a genuinely nice guy. If you are interested in producing and releasing recordings of your music, this is a valuable interview. We discuss the reasons why you should put out a physical medium and the importance of monetizing it and how do you fund these projects. And then he's thinking from a record executive perspective, which is something you should consider, especially if you want to reach out to a record label to help you release your music. This interview was recorded before the pandemic. Enjoy. So like I was telling you before, this is a podcast about the business side of writing music. And why I'm interested in speaking with you is because you have a record label. So more specifically, this is a label about classical music. And even more specific than that, it's a record label about musicians in Chicago. And I wanted to talk to you from your perspective as a CEO and a producer about what it takes, not just on the business side and how can revenue be generated, but what do composers need to know to produce records? And what are you looking for as a record executive? Like, why would you produce a record by one composer and not another? So we'll get through all of that.
Okay.
That's just the operating framework. Tell me the story. How did you come to start Sadie Records and why?
Well, the story goes all the way back to the late 1980s. My personal background included always a great interest in music and recordings. I started collecting records when I was, I think, 7. I got to review records for American Record Guide for a number of years. I ran the classical format at WHPK, the campus radio station, mixed format station of the University of Chicago. I did some work in music PR. Probably most important, I interned for None Such Records between my junior and senior years of college and got to see really the business end, as you put it, of a record label, as well as got to go to some recording sessions and mixing sessions and really get a sense of all this. And so that was the background. And the impetus was realizing that all these wonderful Chicago performers that I would hear, I went to the University of Chicago undergraduate from 83 to 87. I would hear them in live concerts and live broadcasts on the radio on WFMT. And then I'd go to the record store, which around here was Rose Records, to look for recordings of these artists. And there was literally none to be found. And having grown up in New York, this seemed very odd to me because, if you heard a recital in New York and then you went to the record store, of course the artists' recordings would be right there because most of the record labels were based either in New York or on the West Coast. But it seemed like the classical labels, both the majors and the independents, had no clue what was going on in the middle of the country. So I thought, well, geez, somebody should be recording these wonderful musicians. I mean, the one exception, of course, was the Chicago Symphony Orchestra under George Schulte. On
famous recordings, yeah.
Which were recording for London Decca Records back then. But that was it. I mean, there was really no other classical activity. There hadn't been a classical label based here since Mercury Living Presence in the 1950s. So it seemed to me that, like I said, somebody should be recording these terrific musicians. So that was the mission of the label I formed from the start, and formed it as a sole proprietorship just out of savings. But pretty quickly we developed a reputation for the quality of the recordings, and artists started coming to me. And I realized in order to sustain this and branch into all areas of the repertoire, because I should say 9 of our first 10 recordings were solo keyboard. Now, partly that's because the artists I was talking to originally were a lot of keyboard players. Russian emigre pianist Dmitry Paperno, who was head of the piano department at DePaul. Beasley Blackwood, composer and pianist at the University of Chicago since 1958. David Schrader, organist, harpsichordist, forte pianist, both as a soloist in just about every ensemble around town that played classical and pre-classical music, pre-classical era, I should say, music. Like I said, artists started coming to me, and this all really took hold when we got a nice break. The Chicago Symphony and the University of Chicago at the beginning of the 90s were both celebrating their centennials. And so the Chicago Symphony had the idea of commissioning the three major composers at the University of Chicago for pieces. And one of those was Beasley Blackwood, who we had already been recording as both a pianist and a composer. The only one of our first 10 recordings that wasn't solo keyboard was actually his cello sonata. They commissioned his Fifth Symphony, and it just happened to be a lucky thing. It was on 6 different series. So the CSO was going to play this piece 6 different times, about a 25-minute piece. And I came to Henry Fogel, who was the president of the Chicago Symphony, and I said, we might have an interest if we can raise the money in recording this piece. Now, normally, the CSO was on their regular broadcast series, but usually what that meant is WFMT's engineer, which was Mitch Heller back then, would record 2 concerts, usually Thursday, Saturday, spliced between the coughs, and that's what goes on the air, and that's it. I approached Henry about the idea of recording all 6 concerts, and he readily agreed to put up the money to have Mitch record all 6. But the deal with the musicians, and of course, Chicago Symphony is a union orchestra, is that we couldn't actually use the material until they got paid. And Chicago Symphony rates were pretty high back then. So this was recorded and quote unquote in the can. And then I watched as the symphony raised money so that we could actually use the material.
You mean they got paid for their performance? That's one issue. And the union has recording payment schedule that's on a separate...
Right.
Yeah, okay. So they had to get paid for that before you could edit.
And there are 2 ways you do this. One is to actually have recording sessions, which they'd be paid separately for. But the other way is to use material from the live concerts, and you pay on the basis of the length of the piece. So you have to pay them, I think, an hour for 10 minutes of actual final music.
Okay.
At a minimum. So I watched as the Chicago Symphony raised the money for this from different granting organizations like the Aaron Copland for Music, National Endowment for the Arts, and private donors as well. And I realized that with our focus on local musicians, I should be doing this directly, going forward. And I got some very good advice from Herman Krawitz, who is the head of New World Records, which is really the only model I knew of as a nonprofit label. The New World's mission was and still is American composers. So we took their structure, but applied it to our mission of Chicago musicians.
Got it.
So we actually formed the not-for-profit at the end of 93, officially on January 1, 94, took over the label, and we haven't looked back.
So what is the benefit of being a nonprofit record label as opposed to a for-profit label?
Well, in classical, it's huge because the classical music business really isn't a money-making thing. I mean, every once in a while there's a big hit like Three Tenors, and then the industry spends the next quarter century, trying to chase lightning in a bottle again.
Right.
But in reality, the classical arms of the major record labels were always the prestige, arms. They were never the profit centers. Henry Fogel likes to tell a story about how Columbia Records used to claim a profit from its classical division by counting all the Broadway hits as classical.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Oh, creative bookkeeping there.
Yes. Yes, the classical records were not making money, in other words.
Of course.
And never were.
You're kind of opening up a door I wanted to walk through. Maybe we should just go through it. What is the value of investing in this right now? And you seem to have an emphasis on making physical media, CDs.
I wouldn't say that. I mean, most of our revenues these days are from streaming, like everybody else.
Okay.
Yep. But we still believe in the importance of the physical product. As one of our musicians said, it's my business card times 1,000.
Absolutely.
And to be taken seriously by critics, for example, they still want to see that physical product.
Okay.
Yeah. And there still is a market for it. It just is not what it used to be by any means. To get people to buy a physical product, you really have to come up with an album that's worth, collecting. Whereas, the money that's made from streaming, the key there is, it used to be you sell a CD and whether or not somebody listened to it, you got your revenue.
Yes.
With streaming, you got to get people actually listening and repeatedly listening to your music to make the revenue. So it's a very different approach.
On average, let's say a recording project by a chamber group of less than 12 people, and they're going to do a 45-minute long album. What would be the expense to the label to produce it? Would that be $30,000? I mean, I'm talking averages.
Well, so we have to fold in, because so much of our structure is a little different from most labels, because as the president of the company, I also produce most, getting to be, again, well, for the first half of the life of the label, I produced all the recordings. Then the job of running the label and the increased job of fundraising made it impossible for me to do that and still produce all of them. So start hiring outside producers, especially people like Judy Sherman, multiple Grammy winner, to produce some basically the ones I didn't. But I still produce the majority, and lately I've been producing more and more. So that sort of side of my salary gets factored in when we do a budget, for a recording. Same thing with our engineer, Bill Malone, who's been on staff since, somewhere in the 90s. I hired him full time.
Didn't he record our event a few Novembers ago when I interviewed Stacy?
Oh, probably.
Yeah, he was fantastic.
Yeah, he's tremendous. So multiple Grammy nominee, I should say,
Sure.
Bill Malone. So those in-house costs we actually include in our budgets. We would never put out a recording that's only 45 minutes, by the way. There are a handful that are under an hour, but that's the exception. And many of ours really push right up to the limit of what you can put on a CD. And actually sometimes beyond. We will often do a double disc, but sell it at a single disc price because we see it as sort of one quote unquote album.
Absolutely.
So, but in any case, we say that the average is about 70, but that's because there are some projects that are way more expensive than others. So I would say the median cost is probably in the 55 to 60 range for us, counting all those costs.
Well, and there are many labels out right now where that they'd be happy to distribute, but the composer, the performer pays for the venue, pays for the engineer, pays for the time.
Yeah, we pay for all that.
And you're covering it all.
Right.
So from my perspective, that seems like a win. Mm-hmm. But then when do you generate profit? If you put out $50,000 to $70,000.
The answer is we don't on individual albums. I'm including in that costs the promotion as well, getting it into the hands of
absolutely.
Of those critics, getting it advertised in various venues. Of course, we have a part-time person who's now all about promoting our stuff on social media. That those costs have to be covered too. As I mentioned before, our base is contributed revenue. Most of that is general operating funds. People donate because of the mission. Mm-hmm. But we are also, especially recently, gotten better at project-specific funding. So we take a project and say, oh, you know what? We know somebody who's really interested in this group or this repertoire or this composer. Let's see if they'd be willing to kick in something towards this specific recording. At our gala, we have an annual gala called Soiree Sadie. And most of our revenue from that gala is from the sponsorships and ticket sales, which goes to general funds. But we also take the opportunity at the dinner to raise money towards a specific project. Often it's a project involving one of the performers who's just performed in the concert portion of our gala. That might be their next album, for example. So people are hopefully primed to be interested in this group or their recording. And so that's an example of where we can raise some project-specific funding as well. We usually ask our board to throw in a little something extra towards one project a year as well. So we call that our board-sponsored album.
Oh,
yeah,
I see.
So these are all these different methods for raising revenue towards specific projects as well as towards our general mission.
And because you're nonprofit, it's a lot easier to raise funds.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's the whole point.
And we've actually raised another thing we've raised money for in this. Since you talk a lot about composers, is we will raise money for commissions.
Okay.
And in return, so the commissioner gets a tax deduction because if he gave it straight to the composer, no tax deduction. Gives it to a nonprofit, they get a tax deduction. The benefit to us is we then get the right to make the first recording.
Yeah, which will then obviously become that composer's business card too. So they're going to be pushing it. It's a win for everyone involved.
The most recent example of this is actually an album we released this year with Anthony and Damari McGill, brothers from originally grew up on the south side of Chicago. Now one is principal clarinet, Anthony of the New York Philharmonic, Damari is principal flute of the Seattle Symphony. And we did an album of concertos or concerto-like pieces for flute and clarinet and orchestra with the Chicago Youth Symphony Orchestra, which is, of course, where they came out of. So it's kind of a homecoming story for them. And we commissioned a piece from Michael Abels, who we actually started recording a long time ago. Of course, he's gotten very well known since he's written the film scores for Jordan Peele's Get Out and Us. But he wrote a piece for them and the Youth Symphony called Winged Creatures. So that was a direct Sadie commission.
Oh, is it? Yeah. Is he a Chicago native?
No, he's actually from L.A.
Okay.
Yeah, most of our commissions have involved Chicago composers. But in this case, we needed a piece that would be really idiomatic for these musicians. And frankly, we needed it on shorter notice than we would have liked. So we said, okay, who's a really good composer who's also can be fairly quick?
A film composer.
Michael fit the bill perfectly, yes. And this is actually the third piece we've recorded of his. So.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah, I think very highly of his music. Okay, so you had just said that you don't ever really see a profitable point in the album. And you're not thinking about album specifics like that. I'm getting the impression that you're thinking about the whole catalog.
Right. So, I mean, what we're looking for in our albums is two things. We'll make a significant contribution to the catalog, and then because of our specific mission, what is going to be the most useful to these musicians, to their careers. So we're all about, especially in more recent years, about career building and working hand in glove with these artists on a plan, especially ones who are going to record more often. What is the plan for using these recordings to promote their careers? And there are certain artists like Rachel Barden-Pine, for example, who can point to many specific benefits she's gotten from the recordings that she's made with Sadie that have advanced her career. Or since you, again, very interested in composers, and I was interested when you were giving the litany at the beginning of the ways composers make revenue, make their money. Mm-hmm. Composer we've worked with now on 10 different albums, including 2 that were devoted entirely to her music, is Stacy Garrick, Chicago composer.
Love Stacy.
And she credits Sadie and her recordings on CD largely with getting her the notice she needed so that she started getting enough commissions that she could actually give up the teaching side and purely be working on composing.
Yeah, and she's been featured on the podcast 2 times. One of them that you actually helped make possible.
Oh, well, glad to do that.
When we did the live event. This is really interesting. So I love how you are thinking about helping everyone involved get to the next level. Mm-hmm. And one of the questions I wanted to ask you, because you're approaching this from the other side of the table, so to speak, what are things that composers can do to make it easier for you as a record label to say yes? And I want to speak in generalities because I know that there are a lot of people who aren't in Chicago or don't have Chicago ties. But just thinking in terms of record labels, what can a composer do to promote their career to make it easier for you to say, I want to make this project a reality?
Well, one thing is professionalism in terms of how you make the approach. If you send me an email saying, I want to record this piece and have it out in 3 months, and I've never even heard your music before, that's probably not going to be a very successful approach.
Sure.
If you send me an email saying, I'd like to get you to get familiarized with my music, here are some links, here's a concert coming up, not tomorrow, which, believe it or not, I've had people do that. I've got to, say, write me, I've got a concert tomorrow, can you come? No, I have this concert in 8 weeks. Are you available to come here? So I think that's one, is just having a little bit of thought to your approach. Of course, for me, if you're not a Chicago composer, for Sadie at least, you're going to need to say, okay, here's a Chicago group that's playing my music, or a Chicago artist.
Right.
Because our mission is very much locally focused. And even if you are a Chicago composer, it's still better from the point of view of the label's mission to not only have the composer be Chicago, but to actually have at least some of the performers be Chicago. Even typically with a Chicago composer, we're still going to have a Chicago ensemble, or at least a Chicago soloist if it's performing with another ensemble. But our recordings have to have these deep roots in Chicago. Mm-hmm. Can't be, I want you to release a recording of my music with the London Symphony Strings conducted by, God knows who.
I'm going to circle back to the mission of the label in a second. I'm a big advocate, and I'm always telling composers to make it easy for someone to say yes, whether that's a commissioner or the purchaser of whatever. And I'm thinking off the cuff here, but I could imagine if I came to you and said, I've got this project, I'm working with this Chicago-based group, and if I had laid a lot of the groundwork for you, would that predispose you to at least consider it?
As long as you're not in a rush, because we plan our recordings far ahead. So,
sure.
And that happens to a lot. It says people say, I have this project, I really want it out in 9 months or whatever. And it's like, no, that's not going to happen.
Right.
But yeah, if you have a group that's interested, if you can point me to an existing performance, if you don't have that, can you send me at least a score and a decent MIDI realization so I have some idea of what your piece sounds like? These are all things that can help.
Great. So what I was thinking about the mission here, I told you I'd circle back to it.
No problem.
Is how often do you see people reaching out and they haven't really looked you up at all?
It happens. Often we get ones that I say to my operations director, please send them I'm sorry, there's no Chicago basis at all to this project note, Yeah. So that does happen, yeah.
It's critical for those who are listening that if you're going to reach out to a label,
know what they do.
Know what they do. Who have they already recorded? What are they recording?
Yeah, and if you're a contemporary composer who's writing music that's very, shall we say, romantic or conventional, or it might be beautiful, but has absolutely no modern edge to it, don't send it to Cantaloupe Records. They're not going to be interested. Right?
Yeah. You got to get the right fit. Absolutely. And the ensemble's part of that in the city.
Yeah.
So most people who are listening might not know this, but your mother is the venerable Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And there are very famous stories about her being a lover of opera. And now operas have been written about her. Mm-hmm. So what was that like growing up in a household where music was all around? I mean, clearly you said that from a child, you just were into it. And your mom is a public figure. And how has that played a role in your life? The Venn diagram of where those overlap.
Well, of course, Mom wasn't a public figure when I was growing up.
Sure.
But Mom likes to say James was a lively child, but that she noticed right away that if there was classical music playing, I would sit up and take notice and pay attention and stop running around like a crazy man, And they had a nice, record collection that I would listen to, but they also would take my parents to Little Orchestra Society concerts at Hunter College, which was actually across the street from where we lived, to play things like Light Opera of Manhattan, which was Gilbert and Sullivan's, young people's concerts at the New York Philharmonic, which were conducted by Michael Tilson Thomas when I was growing up.
Wow.
And pretty soon I graduated to the New York City Opera and the Met and was going to all the operas with my parents.
Wow.
Yeah. I would walk around this pre-Walkman day, so I would have my Radio Shack tape recorder and be listening to The Marriage of Figaro while I was walking down the street.
Well, everyone else is playing disco music or Michael Jackson.
Exactly. Yeah.
Wow, that's amazing. So does your mom still attend the opera?
Oh, of course.
Yeah.
She's regular at the Washington National Opera, which the Kennedy Center is right across the street from us. Makes occasional trips to see the Metropolitan Opera in New York. Our summers are, for my wife and me, largely consist of following Mom around to her favorite opera festivals, which are Glimmerglass, which is in Cooperstown, New York, and Santa Fe.
Yeah, lots of opera down there.
Yeah.
Are you dreaming of writing an opera? A new work for choir? A song cycle for your soprano friend? Then it's time to get serious about writing for the voice. Hi, I'm Dr. Lisa Neer, mezzo-soprano and composer, and I'm sponsoring this episode of The Portfolio Composer. Let's face it, orchestration books barely tell you anything when it comes to writing for voices. You're lucky if there's even a section outlining vocal ranges. That's just not enough. Because unlike instruments, singers perform text. Vocal music is the alignment of word, rhythm, and pitch. And if those words are going to be sung expressively and be understood, there is a lot more to it than just having a range chart nearby. And these principles apply even if you're writing experimental music, using noises and sounds rather than words. I'm on a mission to empower composers to write vocal music that singers love to perform and that audiences love to listen to. That's why I'm inviting you to Text Setting Like a Boss, my free 3-day training for composers. If you have big dreams to write for voice, and you should, there's money to be made writing vocal music. You need this training. Sign up now for my free 3-day training, Text Setting Like a Boss, February 2nd, 3rd, and 4th. Visit www.lisaneermusic.com and sign up today. That's www.lisanehermusic.com and sign up today.
This episode is sponsored by Dorico, the future of scoring. And we want to feature real Dorico users so you can know that real composers out in the world today are using Dorico to make their careers happen.
My name is Adam Shoemaker. I'm an arts administrator and composer and professor. The more I learn, the more impressed I am. It's just like, oh, wow, they did it that way. That's so smart. Just the ability to start from no real commitment of key and meter, and then being able to make those changes on the fly without dire consequences was really a cool feature. It runs really well. I first launched Dorico on an 11-year-old iMac, and I really didn't have many problems notating in it, even with the old computer. Now that my setup's more modernized, it's been so fast and so fluid. It looks great and it feels great, and it's easy to play off of as a performer. As a previous user of both of the mainstream notation softwares out there, I can highly recommend Dorico as a great solution for anybody entering the notation software world or looking to switch. Dorico just really took its time to figure out the best way to do things to service composers and arrangers and performers. It's really just the smarter way to notate your music, in my opinion. It's been a joy to use. Every time I'm trying to learn a new skill within Dorico, once I learn it, I'm like, oh, that was actually so much fun to learn. And I usually remember it and it sticks with me. And I feel like in the past, I've always been like, oh man, that was so cumbersome. But in Dorico, I have yet to run into something that I cannot do and not do easily. I feel supported by the software's capabilities. And also, the team too, the team behind Dorico, they're so attentive and helpful and ready to assist. They want to make this a great opportunity for everybody that's using it. And so I'm really pleased with the customer service behind the Dorico too.
The kind folks at Dorico have set up a special web page so you can go and download a free 30-day trial copy of Dorico. So go and do that. I have been using the program and I'm absolutely in love with it. Go to www.steinberg.net/TPC. So when you were growing up, what instrument did you study?
Piano.
Okay. Do you still play?
No, I gave it up a long time ago. I did study it for about 13 years, but never got particularly good at it. I like to say I play the digital editor now.
Right, and you do, yeah. Tell us a little bit about what you're doing as a producer and as a digital editor.
So when I'm producing a recording, of course, I'll be running the recording sessions themselves. So I'm working with the musicians. I'll prepare for the sessions by listening through the scores with whatever recordings are available. Ideally, it's live performances by the musicians I'm going to be recording, because then I know exactly what to listen for, but often that's not possible. So I'll find some recording if possible. If it's a new work, it may only be a MIDI realization, as I mentioned before, but I always want to have some sense of the score going in. And one of the things I try to do is map out the score in terms of, because if you got a 15-minute movement or piece, you're not just going to play 15 minutes at a time. You're going to need to break it up into sections to make it manageable. And so that's the first thing I try to do, is come up with those manageable sections to give them musicians target points of where to go. Also, their practical considerations, like where are the page turns?
Yes.
So you often want to have a section end before somebody's going to be turning a page so that they can then have the page turned and start the next section. These are the kind of practical things you have to think about sometimes in recording. So I try to map out the scores ahead of time for things like that. Then you go into the sessions and work with the musicians in terms of, first you get your sound, of course, and my engineer, Bill Malone, is brilliant at that. So I usually don't have to do a lot there. But what we'll try to do, let's say it's a chamber group, is we'll have them play something that involves everybody in different volume levels and whatnot. And then we'll ask them to come back and listen. And we'll say, don't worry about whether it's like reverberant or not or anything like that, because that we can take care of later. What we want you to tell us is, do you feel like we've got a good fix on your instrument? Are you too close to the mic? Do you feel maybe you're sounding a little distant? Because those are things you really have to get at the session. In terms of the actual, mixing of things together, that can be done later. That wasn't true, by the way, in the beginning. In the beginning, we had to go straight, mix down to 2 tracks right away at the session.
Wow.
But now,
straight to tape.
Yeah. Well, straight to 2 tracks for
Sure.
editing. Actually, I'm working on a symphony right now, which we are editing in 32 different channels.
It makes a lot of edits.
It makes for a lot of flexibility in the mixing.
Okay.
So, you might have one place where you really need to bring up a percussion instrument and another place where you really don't want that percussion mic on at all, right? So you can do that if you've got that many different channels to work with. Actually, what's interesting is my editing system, I can only listen to 16 of those channels. The others sort of travel with them. So my engineer will give me the 16 he thinks are the most important for me to hear. Whether I'm hearing exactly the right level on the marimba, I can wait for the mix for that.
Got it.
I can get enough of the marimba from the other mics to know that it's there and make sure that all the notes are right. But I'm not worried too much about the mix when I'm doing the editing. I'm just worried about the notes at that point. So anyway, we get the musicians involved to make sure they're happy with their sound. Then we start recording in earnest and working through those sections. And sometimes you also want to get longer takes too. Often what we'll do is, let's say you've got a movement that's 6 minutes long. Do a full take, maybe even 2, then start working in sections to make sure everything's covered so that everybody's happy with everything. And what's interesting to me is I've discovered that the players and the producer often are listening for different things. Yes, we want to make sure the notes are right.
Yeah.
But sometimes there'll be, something interpretively that's very important to the musicians that I wouldn't have a clue was important. And then there'll be other things that they'll play and think sounds fine. I'll say, that just doesn't sound quite right to me. Maybe you need to accent this more or something. And sometimes I've even sat in on sessions that other people have been producing, and the producer will hear one thing that I would have missed, but then I'll hear things that producer didn't think of. Every set of ears is different.
Yeah.
So anyway, eventually you get where you're pretty happy with everything, and then you say, having learned everything we've learned working through sections, let's do one more take of the whole movement. And often you get your best material from that list.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
So I've often kind of debated with myself, what is the value of a classical music producer? But what I'm hearing you say and what I'm learning is that it's critical.
Well, the musicians, they tell me that. They tell me knowing that I'm listening for stuff gives them the freedom just to play.
Right.
Now, that doesn't mean they won't remember that, I had a wrong note here, or I played this, this note in the wrong octave or whatever. But they don't have to think too hard about it, As I and the other producers I've watched we always call for confessions at the end of a take. So if a player knows something didn't go right, they can just tell us, because we don't always catch everything.
Right.
Then I will tell them, okay, here are the things that I heard. And sometimes they'll be, no, I meant to do that. And I'm like, okay, if that was a conscious choice, great. But other times they're like, I didn't realize it was coming across that way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and then you're also there to make sure the vibe is right. Like you can get notes and rhythms correct.
Absolutely.
But there might not be energy in the room.
That's exactly right. And sometimes I've found that especially in recording sessions, musicians do get a little too concerned about that. And I have to say, you know what? We've got the notes covered. Let's play this take not worrying about any of that and really go for this feel or whatever. Yes, absolutely.
So what is your opinion on creating these kind of Uber recordings? What I mean is they're perfect. Between all the takes, and you'd never hear that piece performed live in the same way.
Well, that's okay, because as wonderful as recordings are, there's still nothing like being live in the moment.
Absolutely.
But being live in the moment in the space. What's interesting is if you take back a live recording and listen to it at home, it often doesn't have that same feel. And some do. So, there are some performances that are just so spectacular they'll transcend that. But often when you take it home and you're not in the moment, in the space, you'll start to hear all the intonation errors or the ensemble problems that went right past you because you were just enjoying the performance so much in the live venue. And that's where a recording, for me, should be something for multiple times listening, so that no matter how many times you listen to it, you're going to get that enjoyment and not be noticing more and more errors every time you listen.
Right. So one of the things that came to mind just now as you were saying that is the saying, you can take a recording out of the room, but you can't take the room out of the recording. Uh-huh. And then what considerations do you have to finding the right venue? Or do you have a favorite place you like to record so that you can create that multiple listening benefit?
We do have some favorite places. A lot of it has to do with logistics or, what's available. Frankly, there's some venues that are just so expensive that unless we have major, funding to cover that, they're just not things we can consider. I mean, some of the best venues, and most of ours, of course, are in town. There's Northwestern has Galvin Recital Hall, which is this beautiful hall overlooking the lake up in Evanston. We did an album with, actually it was the debut album of this ensemble, Black Oak Ensemble, all music of composers who were persecuted and all but one case murdered in the Holocaust. Really powerful stuff, string trios. And the album's titled Silenced Voices, and getting to record in that space was just spectacular for us, and I hope we'll get to use it again. It's a little tricky because it's, as I mentioned, it's at Northwestern University, and of course it gets a lot of use from the students and
absolutely,
and other things. But happily, this group had faculty members, so that's how we were able to get in the hall for that one. In the past, we've recorded the Grant Park Orchestra in the Harris Theater for Music and Dance, which is also acoustically really terrific. It's about a 1,500-seat hall. It's actually the sort of back and underneath of the Pritzker Pavilion, the Frank Gehry structure in Grant Park, in Millennium Park. And we could do that because the Pritzker Pavilion / Harris Theater is essentially the summer home of the Grant Park Orchestra. They've already got the space. So there was not a rental involved in our case. Nichols Hall, the Music Institute of Chicago, another music school, is really nice acoustic we've used. Logan Center at the University of Chicago has a chamber music hall that we use a lot, and not only is that a really good space in terms of the sound and being able to record, but it's also a really nice setup for us because we have a whole room. Often in these things we have to sort of have either a really cramped booth or are setting up our equipment in the loading dock.
Yeah.
But in this case, there's actually the so-called green room where we get to set up all our equipment and have a TV monitor so we can see the players as well.
Oh, that's nice.
Yeah, so when we have a nice setup like that, we certainly like to take advantage of that.
Okay. And when you're listening to a room?
And that's the other thing. So if we're in the loading dock right off stage, we have to be listening on headphones. But if we have a whole room to ourselves sufficiently removed from the stage, then we can actually be listening on nice speakers, which is, of course, always going to be my preference.
Sure.
Yeah.
I'm interested in what qualities you look for in a room. What makes a room a good room for recording?
Well, frankly, we do have ways of enhancing acoustics, but if you can get a good start, at least from the room, sometimes you get everything. We got to record a project involving a Chicago conductor and soloists with the Czech National Symphony Orchestra in the Dvorak Hall of the Rudolfinum, and we didn't have to add anything to that.
Oh, really?
Acoustic was so perfect for recording there. But again, if you have an acoustic that's as good as Galvin Hall or like that Logan Center, we have to add a little bit, but still we get a nice start. We are capable of making a good recording in the studio. Over the years, we've made a lot of recordings at the Faye and Daniel Levin Performance Studio, WFMT, and even before that, their studio when WFMT used to be in downtown Chicago, they had a smaller studio than they have now, and we made recordings there too. But more and more we are moving towards concert halls whenever we can because we just find we do get a better sound that way.
I would imagine so. Even for smaller chamber groups?
Yeah.
Like that's a better placement to stick a quartet in a large hall rather than in a smaller room?
Yeah. I mean, it doesn't have to be a huge hall. Although when the Pacifica Quartet was based at the University of Illinois, as well as at the University of Chicago for many years, getting to record in the Krannert Center, which is a place the Chicago Symphony Orchestra used to travel to make recordings, was nothing to sneeze at.
I'm sure.
Yeah.
I'm sure. Well, one of the things I love asking people who are on the podcast is, in your opinion, what are one or two actions that a composer could do today to help drive their career forward?
Well, everything these days is about social media. So you need to have a good social media presence. Again, Stacy Garrick is a perfect example of a composer who knows what she's doing. And you look at her posts, and even what looks like the most innocuous post is getting hundreds of likes. Mm-hmm. She's developed such a following. She also does a regular email newsletter, which is very neatly designed. So those are the kinds of things you really need to do to get your name out there and stay out there.
So social media and staying in touch with your audience.
Oh, absolutely. And having something interesting to say.
Sure. Well, that's hard sometimes.
Yeah.
Composers feel like they can put it in music more readily than words. So
Yeah. And so maybe you put on snippets. Jim Stevenson's another example. He's another Chicago composer we've been recording, and he'll put up like little musical snippets on Facebook. He'll compose like a little ditty in connection with something in the news or something. And, that obviously grabs attention as well.
Yeah, absolutely. What are some things that you've seen over the years, building Sadie Records and being a record producer, where you felt like, man, that's really hurting what that composer's trying to do? Kind of, what do composers do that shoot themselves in the foot?
Oh, a great example of this, may he rest in peace, is David Diamond.
Okay.
Whose reaction to feeling that his music was not being programmed enough was to hound people to death.
Really?
And then they never wanted to program his music.
Wow.
Yeah, he was, the Jewish term is a nudge. But yeah, he would give people such grief that, like I said, they wouldn't want to have anything to do with him, which is a pity because I think he was one of the great American composers of the second half of the 20th century.
I remember the first time I heard it was his Third Symphony.
Yeah.
Changed my world.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He had a long life and career. So yeah, his music actually dates, some of it even comes from even the first half of the 20th century. He lived a long time. And we actually did an album of his with the Chicago chamber musicians called David Diamond Chamber Music, and it included 3 world premieres. And he loved that album. He just raved about it. It was actually an 80th birthday tribute.
Wow.
So I think it was about 1995. Yeah. So he didn't have a problem with us, certainly. But like I said, you can't wear your emotions on your sleeve in what is still a business, right?
Yeah, it is a business.
So you have to have a more, shall we say, restrained approach. And you have to accept that certain organizations or conductors or administrators, for whatever reason, are not programming your music, and kind of persevere, and maybe not hound them every year, but maybe you build more of a reputation. Maybe you come back in 5 years and say, would you reconsider, But you have to pick your battles.
Do you think he was demanding rather than asking and not focused on the relationship and like what's in it for them?
Yes. Again, Stacy is just such a good example. When she works with a commissioner or whatever, she really delves into what their interests are. Because she wants to come up with a piece that's going to be really meaningful to them, whether it's, whether there's a certain theme there in terms of culture or politics or instrumentation, whatever it is. She really takes the time to get to know who she's writing for, whether it's a commissioner or an ensemble. She wants to know what that ensemble's strengths are so she can write to them. Mm-hmm. But the negative side would be taking a one-size-fits-all approach, right? And just writing, what you want to write regardless of who you're writing for.
One of the first mistakes I ever made with one of my first commissions is I'd written this choral piece that won these awards. It was great, and that led to a commission. And I'm like, well, I'm going to write this new music rather than really listening to what that person wanted.
Right.
And I had an opportunity that I completely wasted.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Yeah, it was part of my learning experience.
I would say it was, yeah. Douglas Adams defines a learning experience as that thing you just did, don't do it again.
You got to love Douglas Adams. Oh, yeah. No, that's great. Just don't do it again. Absolutely. So you might be opening yourself up here to a floodgate of emails, but are you, in general, open to cold emails from composers or performers?
Oh, yeah. We take submissions. In fact, we're redoing our website right now, and one of the conscious decisions about the new design is we're going to have a fairly prominent place where it says, submit a proposal.
Oh, okay.
It will link to a page which has much more detailed explanation of how you submit a proposal and, and what our mission is and what fits and whatnot. We get so many proposals now, like last year it's been about 50, and we only put out typically about 8 records a year. So you do the math.
Right.
So I've actually got now a committee of my board called the Artistic Advisory Committee that helps advise me on these things. So we'll collect up all the proposals 2 or 3 times a year and come to this committee, and I'll say, okay, here's what I think we should be doing. And, so there'll be some I'll say, this seems to me a no-brainer. We've got to do this. Here are a bunch that I really just don't think will make the cut given our limitations. And then there might be some, in the middle where that engenders some discussion. Does this fit our mission? Is this a project that really is going to help this musician? Is Does this musician have a career that really can be promoted? Fortunately or unfortunately, that's something we have to think about. Especially with soloists and small ensembles, if you're not touring, there's no point in putting out a record because there's nothing to support the record and vice versa. With larger ensembles, it's different, of course, because they tend to be rooted, right?
Sure.
We're not expecting the Grant Park Orchestra to be playing somewhere other than Grant Park.
No. Well, in my mind, I'm trying to translate that to a composer. So what are the actions composers take that give you that same sense of motion in their career?
Good question. I'd like to see that their music is being performed.
Okay.
And performed in different places. And maybe not just performed at the university they teach at, for example.
Right.
So that would definitely be a consideration. Also, if you can already see some kind of arc to the career, or I should say trajectory is probably a better word, so you can see that they've gone from just a couple of performances to more and more groups. Now I've got a residency with this orchestra or whatever. That's a good sign.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, that seems like really useful stuff.
Yeah.
What's your opinion on the vanity label? I don't want to name names, but we can both think of a few where the idea is that the composer, the performer pays for everything,
right,
and they just distribute it.
It might be a necessary evil in some cases. Obviously, at Sadie, we're trying to give the composer or performers kind of what they are coming to a vanity label for, but we're doing the investing. And frankly, we have a reputation that's much stronger than those vanity labels, so we can really help composers and performers get noticed. Because I think, critics these days, when they see a recording on Sadie, they say, okay, there's going to be a level of quality here we're expecting. We've also consistently been getting recognition from our peers at the Recording Academy. We are now up to 18 nominations and 6 awards.
Congratulations.
And this is all since, 2003, I guess, was our first nomination. So for the first 14, 15 years of the label, we didn't get any notice from the Academy. But once they started noticing our work, it's pretty much at least one nomination a year. And some years we've had as many as 3. And like I said, 6 times we've actually won the awards. So we're getting that kind of recognition too.
That's wonderful. Okay. So you think that the vanity labels might be serving a need?
Yeah, although, these days, how much more notice you get from being on a vanity label than just self-publishing, I'm not sure.
Right, because anyone can
Pretty
make their
much
stuff online.
And, these days, even, again, using the Recording Academy as an example, it used to be to be qualified for membership, you actually had to have a physical release, right? Be on, at least 6 tracks on physically released albums. Now they will accept purely digital releases. You have to have more tracks. I think it's 12 on digitally released material. But if you've got 12 tracks that are being streamed, you are eligible for membership in the Recording Academy.
Which allows you to vote?
Right.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, because like I said, it's entirely a peer organization.
So where do you think the future of recording is going, specifically for classical music?
Well, you are seeing a lot of organizations, especially in cities that don't have a Cedille Records, doing their own. So a lot of orchestras have their own labels, for example, including the Chicago Symphony, of course, has Resound. And, of course, San Francisco created their label quite some time ago. And so I think you're seeing a lot of that. They're more artist-led labels, including one called Artist-Led, right? So I think musicians are taking things into their own hands more. I think the advantage of Sadie for artists is they get that artist-led treatment, because I should mention all the projects ideas come to us from the artists. So it's their visions, but they don't actually have to worry about the business side of it. They get to concentrate on making the music because we take care of the business side of it.
Sure.
Yeah.
Should we continue to invest in manufacturing these physical things besides just getting it into the hands of reviewers?
I think yes. I mean, eventually I think CDs are going to become an on-demand thing.
Okay.
We're not there yet. I mean, we're still pressing over 1,000 CDs on a first run for our new albums. There are still collectors who want these things in physical format. And also, internationally, there are still some countries like Japan where people, really still value CDs. They still have Tower Records. So
that's amazing.
Yeah. So I think there is definitely a value to it. And I think it gets you taken more seriously. But whether it's on CD or digitally distributed, the other thing And this is something to think about in terms of self-producing versus working on it with a label, and which label. It still helps to have good distribution. Now, Sadie is very fortunate that since, I think, 2009, we've been with Naxos, which is the world's largest distributor of independent classical music. Mm-hmm. That helps. And in the old days, that was really important for getting into the record shops when there were still record shops, or even getting better placement, with Amazon. And that's still true, actually. But also in terms of being on all the right streaming services, including these days, the HD quality streaming services, and streaming, services around the world. So we're in over 60 different countries, either physically or digitally or both, thanks to Naxos being our distributor. Right. So there are still definitely advantages to having that kind of distribution, which you won't have if you just self-produce and put it on CD Baby.
There are the things you can do that I can't do.
Right.
Yeah, which is the value. Well, Jim, this has been a really interesting conversation.
Oh, I'm so glad.
Yeah, thank you so much for making the time to meet with me, and I'm sure many composers will get a lot of value out of this too.
I hope they do. And again, I've been very lucky to work with so many great Chicago composers. And the ones I've been working with most recently, like, Stacy Garrick and Jim Stevenson, who I've mentioned, I think are really good examples of people who understand how to promote themselves in the current environment. So I would offer them as examples to others.
Yeah. When both have been on the podcast, I'll link to their previous episodes in the show notes for those who are listening.
Terrific.
All right. Well, thank you.
Hey, thank you, Garrett. This has been great.
This episode of The Portfolio Composer has been supported by Dorico, the music notation software from Steinberg. Whether you're a composer or arranger, a teacher or student, working in music engraving and publishing, or working in producing music for media such as film, TV, and games, Dorico is the tool for you. Dorico comes in two versions: Dorico Pro for professionals and Dorico Elements, providing the perfect introduction to the world of scoring. Whichever version you choose, you'll be using software packed full of smart features that produces beautiful results completely automatically, allowing you to get music on the stand more quickly than with any other software. You can bring music into Dorico from your existing software using Music XML or MIDI, and you can try Dorico out completely free of charge for 30 days by downloading a trial version from dorico.com/TPC. Try it today.